Vector databases are the way that large language models search through information. In this video, we're going to use Voiceflow to spin up a vector database really quickly, and then use the vectors with custom models like Mistral, Fine-Tuned GPT, or Llama Index. We're also going to explain how vector databases work at a high level so you can conceptually understand how to best leverage these vectors in your own custom applications. Traditional databases are what you're used to. You have a document, and you have an organized set of keywords that reference this document. When you search these keywords, you pull up the document in question. Now, this works if you have really structured data or you want to go through that process of actually assigning document keywords, but that's not how our brains work. This type of database only understands directional relationships. If I had a document about cats, I could search up the word cat or cat food, and this document would probably show up because I've ascribed the keyword cat to this document. But if I searched up something similar to cat, so for example, dog or pet, the document probably wouldn't show up unless I've actually gone and said that these are keywords that should make this document show up. You can say the same thing about lions, tigers, or anything that's related to the world of cats. So like computers, for example, or memes or GIFs. Now, for us, all of these things are related in our brain. So when we think about cats, we can pull all of these things up. But traditional databases don't work that way. So that's where vector databases come in, because it's looking at comparing concepts. So the concept of cat to the concept of a tiger or a concept of a meme and seeing how similar they are. Let's look at an example that I've got up on my screen here. Now, I'm going to walk you through the process of how you would turn a document into a vector and how these things are searched together. So the first concept we have is this idea of a document. And now this is really from a traditional database where a document is a set length of text that includes information about a specific topic. So then you would search information or you would search a term and that document would show up and you would read the whole document. Now, this isn't really that helpful because sometimes with unstructured data, let's say for a whole book, for example, or a 2-hour podcast that's related to the topic that you're thinking about, the way you think about it and the way that your brain works is you might pull a small piece from that book and then you might pull a small piece from that podcast, put them together and then come up with an answer. And so in this model of a vector database, it does something similar where you take your document, and this might be a 2-hour long podcast or a transcript from a really long video. And then rather than putting it into chapters or pages, you're actually going to break the entire thing down into chunks. And chunks might be like 1,000 characters. And the entire document is just going to be broken down into those 1,000 character pieces. And this process is called chunking. And the reason it works is because each of these 1,000 character pieces are probably about a specific topic. So let's say I had a transcript around people talking about like cats and dogs. One chunk might be about cat facts. Another one might be about cat food. You might have dog food, dog facts, and so on. So once we've got all these chunks, we don't actually have the concept of document anymore. All of these chunks are just floating around in space, right? And they are from different documents. One's from a video, one's from a textbook. Now what we do is we're going to turn these into vectors because we want to find a way to kind of map all these concepts that are similar close together. So what we do is we use a process called embedding. And embedding takes a chunk and it works with a large language model that has a lot of context about all of this different text. And it says, okay, if I have a chunk, let's say, a couple lines that are talking about cat facts or maybe cat food, I'm going to actually turn those into a numerical representation. And that number representation is called a vector. So the easy way to think about a vector is that it's like a point in space, like a 3D point in space. So it's like coordinates in a 3D map. Now, concepts that are similar will have similar positions in that map. And concepts that aren't similar will be farther away. So if you look here, I've given some example values of what this might look like. So you can see that cats start with 1 and 2 and dogs start with 1 and 3. So cat facts and cat food both have the coordinates 1, 2, and then something else. And dog facts and dog food have 1, 3, and then something else. Now you can also see that facts and food are 5 and 7. So cat facts are 1, 2, 5, and cat food is 1, 2, 7. Same with dog facts and dog food, 1, 3, 5, and 1, 3, 7. So if I actually go ahead and map these in a 3D space, it would look something like this, where dog and cat are pretty close together, and apple and banana are way farther apart. You also see that dog and wolf are pretty close together, in the same way that cat and lion might be close together, because they're within the same species. And so if I thought about the concept of animal, I'm thinking generally over here. And it's going to pull in wolf, dogs, cats, and what other animals that I've got stored in this kind of 3D space. If I'm thinking about food or I'm asking a question about food, it's probably going to pull information over here. So it might be about apples, bananas, or whatever it might be. And so you can start to see now that this type of database actually maps out concepts that are similar together. So now when I start asking questions, as long as I've got enough information here in my vector database about dogs, cats, wolves, all different animals, if I said, give me facts about wolves, it'll probably pull up facts about wolves, but it also might pull up facts that relate to dogs and wolves. So it might say, did you know that dogs are also a cousin of wolves? Or that dogs diverged from wolves in whatever century. And so now it's pulling concepts close together rather than just searching for a term from a specific document. So in this case, I may have had a dog fact that was in a podcast and a bunch of facts about wolves that are in a book. But because all of these are just kind of broken out into little chunks, when I search up, hey, give me 10 things about wolves, it's able to pull out anything related to wolves from my entire knowledge base. So now that we've gone over it conceptually, let's hop into Voiceflow and take a look at an example of what happens when you upload a document and it breaks into chunks. So here I am in my Voiceflow knowledge base. To get here, you just go into your Voiceflow project and then just hit the content button and you'll be pulled into the new CMS. This knowledge base is actually a built-in vector database in Voiceflow. So all you have to do is go ahead and hit add sources and you can pick plain text, upload a file, URLs, sitemap, whatever you want. And so for this use case, I'm going to go ahead and upload a bunch of different URLs. And so what's happening here is that Voiceflow is actually going and scraping all the text off of these URLs. And then it's breaking them into chunks and loading them into the database. So you can see here under status, it's parsing documents and processing vectors. So it's doing about 161 of these simultaneously. And you see that some of them are already done. And if you click into one of these, you can see that it has broken the document down into all these different chunks. So you can see here that this document is about building an AI assistant with Claude, and it talks through different steps about how to actually integrate Claude's large language model into your AI assistant with Voiceflow. Now, if I go ahead and ask it a question, and so this goes into being able to actually pull up different chunks from these different documents. So I'll ask it something like, what is a vector database? So now it's going to look through all of the different chunks in my database here and pull together an answer. But really what's interesting for us is looking at the chunks it pulled. So from that question, it pulled 3 chunks that it thought were relevant. One of them from one blog post, another one from a different blog post using machine learning, and a third one on a different blog post talking about context windows. Then what it did is it passed all 3 of these to a specific AI model, so in this case GPT 3.5, and it told it to come up with an answer. So the answer said a vector database is a type of database, blah, 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 summarizes the results. And so that's how a vector database tangibly works. So a lot of this is happening behind the scenes. So you don't actually see a lot of the vectors, but you do see the chunks that are matched. And these chunks are what's passed to an AI model. Now, what's really cool with Voiceflow's database is that you can actually access this directly via an API and just get the chunks and then pass those chunks to your own AI model to be able to process. Heads up, this next section is intended for developers or people with a little bit of understanding of JavaScript. It's a more advanced application of using Voiceflow and a way that you can use it to speed up your development of custom applications. If that's you, feel free to continue on or send this to a developer on your team that you're working with. So let's grab our API key. I'm click the integrations tab over here, and we'll just go to knowledge base API, copy the key, and then we want to go to the knowledge base documentation. So this is developer.voiceflow.com. And when you click on it, it'll take you right to the query API, and that's in the API references section. Now it's great. If I go ahead and drop in my API key here, I can actually test out this API. I need to add a question here for this API to work. So I'm going to say, what is a vector database? And you're going to be able to see what's happening behind the scenes here. Awesome. So here is our response. And so in the response, you can see that a couple things are actually returned. The first one is that different chunks are returned. So these are the chunks that we saw. So it returned 2 different chunks, and that's just because we've got a limit here. So let's go ahead and make this maybe 5. So let's try it again now. Great. So now we've got 5 different chunks that were returned. And the first thing you see here is score. So this is the similarity score. So if you remember in that 3D map, this is how close this chunk is to the question that we asked, where the vectors are. And so the model determines about 75% similar, or 0.75. And so we've got about 5 of them. So the first one here has the actual chunk ID, the document it came from, and then the actual content, which is the chunk itself. And remember, the better your document, so the more structured the text is, whatever it might be, the better the chunks are going to be. And so it's got the content here, the chunk, the source, the URL, the name, etc. And it does that about 5 times for 5 different ones. And it looks like it found some pretty similar chunks. Now, the next thing is that you can see it actually did come up with an answer, because in this model, it's actually sending it to an AI model to answer, and the model is Claude V1. And so it did use tokens, and it came up with an answer to say, vector database is this. Now, one really cool thing about the Voiceflow API is that you can actually turn this AI synthesis off. So if you see here synthesis, let's turn this to false. And you can see it's updated in the body here. And if I try it again now, you notice that it just returns the chunks, but it uses no tokens. And this is because now you're just using the Voiceflow knowledge base like a vector database. You're putting in a search query and you're getting these chunks. Now, this is exactly what I want if I want to use a third-party model like Mistral, like we're about to do. Because what I can do is I can just take the chunks here, and then I can use an API call to pass them to the model that I want. I can even do some more complex stuff. So for example, I can see here that the confidence is pretty low. So I can set a filter to say only accept a confidence above 0.75 or a similarity score above 0.75. And that way I can search through a bunch of different documents and then get the best chunks that are the most relevant. So if I ask something like, how do I build an AI assistant? You'll see that some of the chunks we have a much higher similarity score of 0.87. And this is because we actually have more documents related to how to build an AI assistant in the URLs that I uploaded than deep dive documents on what a vector database is. And so this is great for being able to just induce a base similarity score to make sure that whatever answer you're going to give the user is accurate, or at least is reflective of the question that they're asking. So now we're going to head back into Voiceflow. We're going to look at some of the developer tools we have to be able to work with this API and actually pull out this information. So back in Voiceflow here, there are 2 ways that I can leverage this API. The first one is an easier way with something called the API step. So that allows you to make an API call. But something we introduced more recently that's better for tasks like this that may involve a bit more complexity is a feature called functions. So functions is in the CMS here. And what it does is it actually allows you to make fetch calls to an API and then write JavaScript as well to transform them. So if I start a new function here and I call this example, we can see what it looks like. So it gives me an actual code environment here to start writing my code in, and I'm able to define input and output variables. Now, input variables are what I'm going to get from my project into the function, and the output variables are what the function is going to create. And so in Voiceflow here, you can see I've actually created 2 functions already. And so you can see here that I've got some input variables, which is the API key for my Voiceflow project, and then the question. And then I've got some output variables, which are the chunks and an error message, which I'm then going to pass into my next function, which is actually going to send all this to Mistral. So I'm sending in the chunks and an API key, and then asking a question. So let me show you what I've built here for the get knowledge-based chunks. Now, you can also download both of these functions. I'll link to it in the description just to save you some time. And so if you want, you can import them via this import button here. But I'm going to walk you through the code that I've set up just so you can understand what's going on here. So in the get knowledge-based chunks code, I'm mainly doing 2 things. The first one I'm doing is using the fetch request to call an API. So to call the knowledge-based API that we just looked through and actually get the chunks. So just to walk you through each part of this, the first thing I'm doing here is grabbing my input variables from the canvas. And so I've got my question that a user asked in my Voiceflow API key. The next is I'm just defining the API data. So I've got my endpoint here, which is the query endpoint, and I've got my body, which is a chunk limit of 5. Synthesis is false. And then the settings actually don't matter because I'm not really using these because I'm just returning chunks. And here I've got my question. The next part here is I'm just actually making the API call. So loading in the API key, the URL, and the data that I just defined up here. And I'm just putting in this try catch block. So if there's an error, I can catch it. I check for a couple errors down here. And in this line, I am saving the response from the API into a variable called response body. And then I'm going to start parsing it. So here I pull out the chunks. And so if you go back to our other example, you can see that in this API response, inside of chunks is where our chunks are. So I'm just pulling that out because I don't really care about this other information. And once I've got the chunks, I'm filtering them based on a score. So I want to make sure the score is above 0.8. And then I'm also just removing any other information. So the score, the chunk ID, the document ID, tags, all the rest, we can get rid of them. I just want the information and then the sources. That's it. Then finally, I'm just passing that out into a variable called clean chunks. And that's right over here. So if I go ahead and test this out, and the way I can do this is by actually dragging out this function onto the canvas like this. I can select get knowledge-based chunks. Now I can start building the rest of my project. So let's do, hi, what can I help you with? We're going to link that up. Then we'll use the capture step because I want to capture a question. So we're going to capture the entire user reply, and we're going to capture it to a variable called question. So let's just create a new variable in here called question. Right. Now, whatever user says will be captured in here. We're going to take our functions block that I just created, connect these up. And now we're just going to map these together. So for question, I'm going to use the variable question that I just created. And then for the API key, we need to grab our Voiceflow API key, which was in our settings here. And I'll just go ahead and actually put this up top here. So VF API key. And this way it's a bit easier for me to create. So I'll just say VF API, and we'll just put it in here. Then we can map this variable together. And now it's a bit easier for me to keep track of. Now, outside of this, the function is going to process clean chunks and an error message. So I'm just going to save these in a variable called chunks that I created. And the error message will go into this error one. And now we should be good to go. So what I'll do is just print this out to the canvas here. You can actually see what it's returning. So let's run a quick test here. Hit play. Hi, what can I help you with? How do I build an AI assistant? Now it's going to send this to the knowledge base. You can see that it actually grabbed all the chunks here. So I've got a debug message that's actually showing me everything that's grabbing from the URL. And you can see here that I just printed out the chunks to my step block here, right? So it's got a ton of info. This is the content name. This is the actual chunk information. And it does this a couple times because it's got 2 or 3 chunks, it looks like. So now that we've got this, now the next thing we want to do is we want to actually go ahead and pass this to Mistral. And Mistral is an open source large language model that is a lot cheaper than GPT. It is just as accurate, if not, it's pretty good, I would say. It is a bit slower, but because it's way cheaper, maybe it's something you want to use. And so to do that, I can now do 2 things, right? I can use the API step to make an API call to Mistral, or I can build a function for it. But let's go ahead and see where I can access this. And to do this, I'm actually using a tool called Together. Together is really cool because it has a bunch of open source models that you can access and play around with. So I use this just for testing out. But here we've got Mistral 8X7B. We've also got a bunch of other ones that are built, and they just host it and you can use their API, and it's a lot cheaper than GPT. So this is one that I like playing around with, but feel free to use your own. If you have a fine-tuned model, let's say on OpenAI's platform, or a fine-tuned model hosted somewhere else, you can also use those. I'm just going to use this endpoint because it's a bit easier. So looking at the Together documentation, the actual API call for this model that I'm looking at, Mistral, is pretty simple. So it's, you've got your URL here, API key, content header, and then basically you're just saying, here's your model, and here is the question. And this looks like it is a system prompt for the model. That's pretty much it, just a post request. So if I go back into Voiceflow now and I actually build this out and go back into, we could use the API step to do this and just drag in the API endpoint, the body, the headers. But I wanted to use functions again for this just because it's a bit easier to share. So I'll go back into functions, and I've got one built out here called Mistral 7B. And I'll just walk you through each parts of this again. The input variables we're taking from the canvas are the chunks. So this is what we got from the last function. We've got a Mistral API key that I need to load in, and then the question. Saving those into variables in my function here because I'm going to use same thing as last time. I've got the URL. I've got the body for the URL that I'm going to put in here. And you can see that the way I've organized this is I've got my system prompt that says, answer the question using only the information provided. And then in the amount sent to, and then in the value sent to Mistral, I've got question is question, and then information is chunks. So I'm going to pass the question and the chunks to Mistral, and it's going to come back with a response. This is where I make the API call. So again, it's just right here. So pretty straightforward. It's a post request, just checking for some errors. And then I am taking the answer. So this API comes back with a couple of different things. In there is the answer. So I'm just pulling that out into the answer variable. And then now I am pulling it into an answer variable and putting that back out to the canvas. So pretty straightforward. If you want to learn more about functions, just hit the question mark here and that'll take you to the functions docs. And this will explain everything you need to know about actually creating a function. We're also going to have a landing page coming out soon with examples of different functions that you can use. And there's also examples of functions within here that use different calls. So now that I've created this, I just added a little image and a description. And if I'm going to go ahead and pull this out of the canvas, it looks like this. So in dev, I'm going to create a function step again. I'm going to select a function, Mistral 7b. Let's connect this together. And now let's map these up. So chunks is going to be the chunks variable that I'm saving from this function. Mistral API key, I'm going to add it right here. And then the question is going to be the question that the user asked. So for the API key, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to use my Mistral one and just cut this part out. Great. So I've got a Mistral API key now loaded in, and I can go ahead and test this out. Let's map my output error variable. So answer to answer, and I'll add my text here and say, let's just pick the answer. Awesome. So connecting this up together. So now I've got a full flow where it's taking my question, it's hitting the Voiceflow knowledge base, it's grabbing the chunks, then it's sending those chunks with my question over to Mistral, and then it's answering it in the tool. So let's go ahead and run a test and see if this works. Oh, looks like it ended in an error. So I got the error path here. I do have debug messages on. So let's just go ahead and turn on debug and see. So you can see here that right off the bat, it looks like the first one worked because I got all my chunks. So chunks received, and I was able to retrieve all of my chunks. And then it looked like the function step, the next function step here is missing an input value required for API key. So it looks like I forgot to map these up together, but super helpful when it comes to debugging. So I'm going to go ahead and add in the Mistral API key and map it to my function variable. And now let's run this one again. Taking a bit longer, so no one's going to Mistral this time. And there we go. So a little closer to here in the prototype tool, but when you share this, it looks totally fine. So to build an AI assistant, it follows these steps, blah, 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 blah. And that's pretty awesome. So let's go ahead and hit publish. And I want to see what it looks like on an actual end chatbot. So I publish it. Let's grab my widget code. Now you can go ahead and embed this onto your website. I'm going to just render this on a web page here, just as an example by pasting it into the console. And it pops up here. So it's rendered on the page here. Let's go ahead and start a new chat. Hi, what can I help you with? How do I build an AI assistant? And great. So you can see here that it was able to actually respond. It looked properly formatted. And now I've got a custom bot running on Mistral as an open source model that I was able to customize. So that's pretty much it for the explanation. And so that's an explanation of how a vector database works, how you can use Voiceflow as a vector database. And now you can go ahead and actually send these chunks to whatever third-party model that you want and build them back into Voiceflow and actually come up with an answer. So this is a great way if you're experimenting with open source models, cheaper models, faster models, niche models that you may not have in the tool. If you want to obviously do this all in one, Voiceflow has a response AI step where you can just use one of the models that you can use through Voiceflow, so Claude, GPT, etc. But this is really useful if you want to build more complex apps using your kind of backend systems or fine-tuned models. You can do that in Voiceflow. And just a reminder, if you want to grab these functions, just click the link in the description. You'll be able to just download the JSON file and then import them to save yourself some time. But then, yeah, just make sure you can go through, you can modify the code however you want, and you can start using Voiceflow with third-party models today. That's it for this video. If you found this helpful, remember to like and subscribe and leave a post in the comments letting us know what you want to cover next. But this should be enough of a foundation to help you understand how a vector database works and how you can use Voiceflow as your own vector database to be able to send the chunks to your own third-party model or anywhere else that you want to be able to use them. That's all. My name is Daniel. I'm the head of growth at Voiceflow, and I'll see you in the next video.